All right, count me in whenever we're ready to start recording.
Oh, I started recording like 10 seconds ago.
Why would you do that?
Oh, it provides banter and filler material to put at the start of the episode.
Isn't that just going to sound like lazy and amateurish?
Eric, it's what everyone's doing. Welcome to Spec Media. Enjoy the episode.
Podcast premise is confusing enough as is.
All descriptions of events, people, planets, and species are real. Like fictional real. No fake fictional facts here. The observations, commentary, and analysis are our own. Spoiler warning. If this is, somehow, your first experience with the Star Wars universe, go watch the original trilogy first. If it isn't clear, what you're about to hear is a parody that is not affiliated with the podcast, networks, films, or TV series we're spoofing. Come on.
What you're about to hear is the last part of our 4-part series on the Galactic Empire and the Rebel Alliance's battle on the forest moon of Endor. If you like your stories in some sort of linear order and you haven't heard the earlier segments, well, you might want to catch up by checking those out first. If you don't care, or if you heard those already, well, welcome to Part 4, Behold the Forest Moon. There's a moment that's always stuck with me from the holovid documentaries of the Battle of Endor. One of those moments that's been mostly ignored or forgotten in the histories of that war. We remember so many moments from the Galactic Civil War, but this one didn't make the t-shirts. It's from the middle of the Battle of Endor, in that green and possibly dense forest, smoke filling the air. The Ewoks are running from enemy fire, particularly AT-ST fire that's given the Imperials an edge. 2 Ewoks run through the forest, and an AT-ST fires on them. When the smoke clears, both Ewoks lay on the ground, not moving. One Ewok turns to his fallen comrade and tries to shake him awake. Historians later discovered the names of these 2 Ewoks were Nanta and Roomba. Well, Nanta never wakes up. When I was a kid, I used to tell myself that Nanta hopped up and joined Roomba. As an adult, I know he didn't. I tell this story to underline a fact about this episode. A lot of people died in the Battle of Endor. Ewoks, Rebel Alliance soldiers, many Imperials. Some knew they were going to die before that day, but most had no idea. Like Nanta, or some Imperial soldier just stationed on Endor because he joined up to send money to his family, or to keep them from being killed, or because he hated non-humans. Sanitized versions of the story, the Battle for Endor and the fight against the Empire, gets sold as a fun family adventure. As we get into this episode, we will realize it is anything but a fun little adventure story. This is just a reminder of the human and Ewok cost of war.
This is the commander. Moments ago, this ship received word of a Cylon attack against our home worlds is underway. As of this moment, we are at war.
It's history.
The North remembers.
To Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came. The events.
Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
Winter is coming.
The figure.
It will be a planet of apes.
The Fellowship of the Ring.
The drama.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. The 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday.
We know no king, but the king in
But
the
as
North.
the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. You shall not pass! Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
It's a trap!
It's hardcore history.
Sometimes I like to think about the gambling odds when I look at history. Mentioned this in the second episode of this series. What if Las Vegas set a betting line on the Empire versus the Rebel Alliance? Would anyone take the Rebels? What sort of odds would you even get for that motley crew? One side built planet-destroying super weapons, and the other couldn't even maintain a base. Some casinos even let you gamble in real time. It's the third quarter in a basketball game. You want to bet that Michael Jordan's going to win the game and beat the Monstars? You can do that now. Or say you want to bet that your favorite contestant's going to win the Running Man. You can bet if Sub-Zero's going to behead him or not. So if we're gambling in real time, look at where we are at this point in history. If you remember at the end of the last episode, the leadership of the rebellion were hung upside down on poles as the Ewoks were preparing to eat them. Literally, they're about to be cooked. What odds would you get for the rebels at this point? 100 to 1? 200 to 1 less? How do you get out of this jam? As the rebels hung from cooking spits, fire singeing their clothes, C-3PO tried to intervene. As we went over last episode, the Ewoks treated C-3PO like a god, their long-prophesied golden god, who'd finally returned to them. And the Ewoks planned to cook his rebel friends in his honor. C-3PO was communicating with the Ewoks in what C-3PO himself called their primitive dialect. You can also see why the rebels considered the Ewoks primitive and why that interpretation is passed down throughout history. I've mentioned and discussed at length the Empire's penchant for xenophobia, but the rebels and their many fans weren't immune to this point of view either. For a species unknown outside of Endor, it's a bit surprising that C-3PO could communicate with the Ewoks at all. But given his advanced communication capabilities, how many languages did he know? 3 million? 4 million? He may have just been able to decipher their language, or they inherited their language from previous visitors to the moon. We know, for example, that a spaceship crashed on Endor years before, seeding the planet with foreign species. But C-3PO's interventions failed. He was a god to the Ewoks, but not one who could boss them around or tell them what to do at all. What happens next is fairly well documented by galactic historians, recorded in multiple first-hand accounts of the Battle of Endor and by the historians of the Rebel Alliance, but it would sound pretty silly if I told it to you in any other context. According to the Rebels, Luke Skywalker used his magical abilities, and since this is radio, you can't see that I'm putting air quotes around that, to convince the Ewoks of C-3PO's magic. He's not just a golden god to be put on a pedestal, but a god who can smite them. Luke Skywalker casts some sort of a spell which picks up C-3PO and flies him around in his chair to intimidate the Ewoks. And it worked! 3PO asked for his friends to be freed, and the Ewoks immediately complied. You got it, Golden God. We're gonna do it. Usually I love to have a more rational explanation for an event like this, but searching through my histories, this is the only account that survives. This is truly one of those what-if moments. I've talked about these before. What if Genghis Khan hadn't died, or his son hadn't died of alcoholism? Do the Mongols conquer all of Europe? What if James T. Kirk never joins the Starfleet? Imagine the history of that galaxy if that happens. What if Joffrey let Ned Stark take the black instead of chopping off his head? In this moment, what if the rebels hadn't brought a protocol droid? They had no reason to bring a translator droid after all. Don't really need a translator on this moon. He couldn't fight, and they didn't know that the Ewoks lived there, that he could even speak with them anyway. But if he's not there, they don't escape, they don't shut down the shield generator, and the entire Rebel Alliance is crushed before the battle even begins. No longer the main course for the Ewoks' banquets, things still weren't rosy for Han Solo and his crew. The rebels were miles from the shield generator, split up from the Pathfinders they came with. And just because they'd been saved from being dinner, it didn't mean the Ewoks wanted to help the rebels. But aliens had arrived from another planet, and they brought a golden god with magical powers with them. So they did what any culture would do: have a meeting. In our culture, that meeting would take place at the highest levels of power, in the Oval Office, or at the UN, or the Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco. But if you're an Ewok, it takes place in front of the fire at a council meeting. This gave the rebels a chance to plead their case to Chief Chirpa and his advisors to aid them in their battle. What happens next, though, is disputed. Again, I'm not a historian, I'm just a fan of history, and there are multiple versions of the story, and the traditional version, after being freed, and presumably after eating a feast of hopefully non-human meat, C-3PO told the Ewoks the story of the Rebel Alliance. He regaled the entire village with a stirring saga of the history of the rebellion, with, hopefully, less digressions than myself. Then, after a brief discussion, Chief Chirpa, after being advised by Shaman Logray and his pet iguana that I mentioned in Part 2, decided to aid the rebels, going so far as to make them officially a part of the tribe. And then they partied, which is, I guess, the sort of thing you would do after a meeting like that. That's a fine version, but another history paints a far more dramatic picture, one that you could imagine getting cut for time if it were a movie. But I like it because it heightens the drama that just had to be there. In this version, C-3PO wasn't regaling the Ewoks with a story, but explaining the plight of the Rebel Alliance. But after hearing them speak, Chief Chirpa calmly denied their request for aid. As C-3PO translated to the others, and I quote, Chief Chirpa says it's a very moving story, but it really has nothing to do with the Ewoks. End quote. Next up, Luke Skywalker and General Solo pleaded their cases. Solo argued that they should fight for their friends. Luke tried to explain his religion, the Force. As you could probably guess, it didn't work. Just imagine trying to explain complex political or religious points to a foreign species you just met in a language you barely speak, and yeah, that's about how well it went. Princess Leia, always the diplomat though, had observed the veneration of the trees by the Ewoks, so she simply said, do it because of the trees. That still didn't work. But she influenced one Ewok, Wicket. Wicket stood and addressed the elders. This was likely a bold move in a tribal culture with a clear hierarchy, and I want to quote part of his speech, likely saved from C-3PO's memory banks, because I think it does capture how the Ewoks felt about this threat. And I quote, the friends of the Golden One tell us this force is in great jeopardy, here and everywhere. When the fire reaches the forest, who is safe? Not even the great tree of which all things are a part, nor its leaves, nor its roots, nor its birds. All are in peril, forever and ever. It is a brave thing to confront such a fire, honorable elders. Many will die that the forest lives on. And, after a lengthy digression about leaves and trees, he says, so we must help our leaf brothers, these rebels, for so has come a season of change upon us. End quote. And this moving speech worked. In either version of the story, willing helpers of their new friends or reluctant converts of the cause, the Ewoks agreed to aid the rebels. They provided the rebels with fresh supplies, returned their weapons. Not only that, they sent some of their best scouts. But most of all, the Ewoks knew this forest. Early the next morning, the rebels, including General Solo, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and their droids, rendezvoused with the Pathfinders at the shield generator. Without, it should be mentioned, Luke Skywalker, who had snuck off the night before and given himself up to the Imperial garrison, probably alerting them to the rebels' presence in the forest. Solo and his crew had presumably linked up with the Pathfinders in the night, though the exact specifics weren't captured in the histories I have. Now, this is one of those moments where you have to admire the incredible luck of the Rebel Alliance. These are a bunch of gamblers, literally in Lando Calrissian's case, who keep rolling snake eyes. General Solo would later call the front of the fortress well defended, but you could easily change that to impenetrable. The Imperials had put an AT-AT and several squads right in front of the main entrance. Not even Han Solo had a plane to get through that. But the Ewoks had another option. Wicket tells General Solo about a more lightly defended secret entrance on the other side of the ridge. A back entrance, nothing more than an armored doorway with a large clearing in front of it. This clearing was at most 50 meters in circumference and surrounded by trees. What did Sun Tzu say, and I'm butchering this quote, don't fight the enemy's strength? The Imperials had heavily guarded the main entrance, so just sneak into the back one. At this point, the rebel ground team was still on time for the battle. Admiral Akbar and his ships and Lando Calrissian and his fighters were ready to launch into hyperspace. Not to go off on another tangent here, but imagine the timing required to pull this off. Blow up the shield generator too soon, there's no surprise. Blow it up too late, the offensive can't start. The rebels had to coordinate this across multiple star systems. As the Ewoks and the rebels approach the rear entrance, the situation is better, but still tricky. Instead of multiple squads, they only see 4 scout troopers standing by their speeder bikes. As Han, Chewie, and the Pathfinders discuss their options, one Ewok, Paplu, Wicket's friend and a fellow scout, snuck up to a speeder bike. Without hesitation or forewarning for the rebels, he hopped on the bike, found the switch to turn on, and jetted off into the forest. The 3 remaining scout troopers hopped on their bikes and chased him. This left just one stormtrooper who the rebels took captive. Like the Golden God, this moment has been used in history to make the Ewoks look simplistic. In the holovids of the battle, it sort of plays at this, oh gee, look at the Ewoks being silly. Take C-3PO's commentary at the time. General Solo, it appears our furry companion has gone and done something rather rash. But this moment seems much different from a certain point of view. An Ewok point of view. Probably the 5th time I've said this in this series, or maybe even this episode, but you underestimate the Ewoks at your own peril. Because in reality, this was no accident. Paplu was a skilled Ewok warrior, and he knew exactly how to use a speeder bike. This wasn't luck. This would be like handing the keys of a Humvee to a hobbit. Would he have any idea how to turn it on? What if I asked you to initiate the warp drive on the USS Enterprise? Similarly complicated. But the Ewoks had been scouting the Imperials so well for so long, they knew precisely how to turn on a speeder bike. And it makes you wonder what else they knew. After speeding away, Paplu grabbed a vine to leap off his speeder bike and escape. As much as we discount the Ewoks for their size, you can't undersell their incredible dexterity and agility at times. It also makes this look like a planned maneuver, like Paplu knew exactly where to take the speeder bike to jump off. Just how long and just how much had the Ewoks been studying the Imperial forces, we'll never know. It sure seems like they knew exactly what they were doing. So with the scout troopers distracted, the rebels entered the base. According to one history, they fought at least one blaster battle in the hallways. They killed or disabled 6 stormtroopers at a guard junction while taking 4 casualties. In this skirmish, you get an idea for why Solo brings a Wookiee along. Chewbacca breaks a wall off his hinges to crush 2 stormtroopers during the fight. Again, it's details like this, which is why I love this world and this battle. General Solo and the Pathfinders make their way to the main control room and quickly go to work placing thermal detonators. Then a platoon or so of stormtroopers and Imperial Army soldiers storm in and take them captive. Another version of events is the Imperials jumping out of the walls from hidden compartments. This would support the theory that the Emperor had planned this moment from the very start. The Imperials brought the rebels outside into that clearing I described earlier. The rebels had finally run out of options. If you try to fight back in the middle of this clearing, the hundreds of stormtroopers will just shoot the rebels dead. There's nowhere to hide. I like to study when we discuss war, not just, the tactics and the weapons, but I like to look at the people, and I like to imagine what did those people think at this moment? What was going through their minds? If you imagine the emotions of General Solo, Princess Leia, and the Pathfinders, you have to wonder if they had lost all hope. These were the type of heroes who never lost. They'd suffered pretty severe defeats before, for sure, but how could they imagine winning this one? Often, I like to put myself in the shoes of other people, and even I have trouble wondering how much despair the heroes of the rebellion were feeling in this moment. These were some of the people who hated the Emperor and the Empire more than anyone else in the galaxy. Almost all of them had grudges against the Imperials for various atrocities that were committed against them or their friends. And this was their moment. If they don't destroy the shield generator, their friends will be massacred above, and they can't do anything about it. Again, if you're taking bets in real time, what odds would you give the rebels at this point in history? They're doomed. When General Solo entered the rear of the base, he left C-3PO and R2-D2 waiting outside with Wicket, Teebo, and the other Ewoks. And they all watched as the Imperial troops entered the rear of the base, going to capture the Pathfinders and Solo. The traditional narrative from the holovids focuses on Wicket. When he sees the rebels about to be taken, he runs off, presumably to gather the rest of the tribe to attack, and then they ambush the Imperials. Does this account make any sense? Consider what Wicket had to do. He would have had to run all the way back to Bright Tree Village, which is miles away, tell the elders, who then would have to prepare everyone for battle, gathering weapons and supplies, and get ready to move, then make their way back to the shield generator in what, an hour? Less? How long did it take the rebels to enter this base? 10 minutes at most? It wouldn't take the Imperial forces more than a few minutes to escort the rebels outside. Even if Wicket could run back to the village in time, and we know that Bright Tree Village was miles away from the shield generator, it wasn't right next door. How long would it take to prepare for the battle that is to come? I've always been a believer in the simplest explanation being best. We know from earlier that the Ewoks wanted to expel the Skullheads, their name for stormtroopers, and the rebels were about to do that for them by blowing up the shield generator. We also know that Chief Chirpa, influenced by Wicket, had begun preparing for a showdown with the Imperials. An account from Kes Dameron says that he had scouted out the bunker while Solo was with the Ewoks the night before, and he discovered traps already set by the Ewoks. In fact, Dameron was worried they might have to fight the indigenous peoples. He hadn't met the Ewoks yet, didn't know they were on his side, and the Imperials at the same time. This would explain how the Ewoks moved into place so quickly. They were already there. Wicket didn't run off to gather troops. He was the recon element for Chief Chirpa. He ran off to tell the rest of the troops to get ready for the attack. The moment's come. Simplest explanation is best. And that is this. The Ewoks had already set up one of the greatest ambushes in the entirety of military history. They were just waiting for the perfect moment to launch it. The rebels weren't using the Ewoks. The Ewoks were using the rebels. Longtime listeners know that I usually like to avoid the nitty-gritty details of military weapons and tactics, but it's not due to a lack of interest. I love this stuff. I could describe weapons and tactics all day. I was the type of kid who would model soldiers and was playing war games. I could wax philosophically about the M41A pulse rifle, which fired 900 rounds a minute of 10 by 24 caseless ammunition, and how the Colonial Marines only filled their magazines with 95 bullets out of 100 to prevent jamming. Then let's go ahead and compare that rifle to the MA-5D individual combat weapon system used by the United Nations Space Command. But if I do that, I'm going to lose half of the audience if I didn't already. So I leave out this level of detail, shall we say, out of most episodes, and this can apply especially to small unit tactics. But I'm going to go into some details on tactics here because you have to understand just how difficult what the Ewoks pulled off actually was. The Ewoks had set up the gold standard of ambushes, the fabled three-sided ambush. Most of the time, if you think of an ambush, it's a single-sided ambush. For example, say you want to ambush a patrol moving down a road. You would put all your people on one side of a road, then, when the troops walk down, you open fire. An episode of Band of Brothers, on the D-Day episode, had a perfect example of this. The U.S. paratroopers all line up on one side of the road and ambush a horse-led convoy moving artillery supplies. That's a single-sided ambush. This has its limitations, though, since the force being ambushed can just run the other way, to the opposite side from the fire. The preferred method, taught by the United States Army, is a two-sided ambush. Think of it as an L. Put the machine gun on the small leg as it guns down the troops, and then the long side raids the objective. Viet Cong forces in Vietnam and U.S. soldiers both heavily relied on L-shaped ambushes in the dense jungle. At the height of the Galactic Civil War, Jyn Erso, the leader of the Rebel Alliance's Rogue One team, got trapped in the middle of an L-shaped ambush set by insurgents in the city of Jeddah. But the best ambush is a three-sided ambush. Usually you can't pull this off with firearms because the bullets can ricochet and hit your own troops. Unless you can fire it down into a depression. In the war in Afghanistan, Taliban insurgents used three- or four-sided ambushes on some U.S. bases. Because of the mountainous terrain in the eastern part of the country, U.S. bases were surrounded by high ground on 3 or 4 sides. Another example is the hostage situation on Alcatraz Island in the 1990s. The Navy SEALs were ambushed by the terrorists from above in a 3-sided ambush. The Ewoks managed to surround the Imperials on 3 sides. From a tactical perspective, the Ewoks deserve an A+ for small unit tactics. Specifically, the Ewoks had set up a 3-sided ambush, with a 4th side being the bunker that they had locked to keep the rebels from getting inside, meaning the stormtroopers were caught in an ambush and had no way to escape. But the key to any ambush is surprise. Without it, you don't have an ambush. So take this account from a stormtrooper on the ground, and I quote, "The next day, the rebel fleet arrived and we were attacked by rebel guerrillas who'd been hiding in the woods. We captured them, and word was that the orbital battle was going the way the Emperor had planned. The officers were even talking about how we'd always remember the day we witnessed the end of the rebellion. And then it happened. The Indigents attacked." End quote. No one saw it coming. Here's how another history captures the exact moment, using the rebel droids to lure the stormtroopers into a trap. I quote, "As the stormtroopers rounded the trees, they found R2 and C-3PO standing there quietly, waiting to be taken. The guards moved to take them. They moved too slowly. 15 Ewoks dropped out of the overhanging branches, quickly overpowering the Imperial troops with rocks and clubs. At that, Tebow, perched in another tree, raised a ram's horn to his lips and sounded 3 long blasts from its bell. That was the signal for the Ewoks to attack." End quote. The Ewoks had created a vicious death trap, and they did it while sneaking into place completely undetected. Literally hundreds, if not thousands of Ewoks moved into place around the Imperial garrison, and no one noticed. The Imperials were already planning their victory party. They were completely unprepared for the coming bloodbath. When the Ewoks began their attack, they were vicious. Hundreds of arrows flew from quivers simultaneously, and unlike bullets or blasters, they didn't have to worry about hitting other Ewoks. Again, brilliant. This was a brilliant ambush. Any Imperials in range of close combat were viciously assaulted with spears and axes. Another passage, I quote, "Hundreds of them descended upon the clearing from all sides, throwing themselves against the might of the Imperial army with unrestrained zeal. The scene was unabridged chaos." End quote. The account from a stormtrooper on the ground, Hume Tarl, who I've quoted before, is even worse. And I quote, "I've seen the hollow thrillers, and those directors should admit they were paid to tell New Republic lies. They make those Ewoks look cute, like stuffed toys. I was there, Miss Tawani. They weren't anything close to cute. The first wave of troopers died with arrows through the gaps in their armor. The Indigents were primitive, but later I read about the bows they used, how they were engineered for immense leverage. I saw troopers falling with arrows that had gone through their throats. They were the lucky ones. Some of our men took what looked like minor wounds, and minutes later they were clawing their helmets off and gasping for air. The Abos had dipped their arrows in some kind of nerve toxin that paralyzed every muscle in the body. Troopers who got hit suffocated because their lungs wouldn't work. I saw dying men staring into the sun trying to blink." End quote. When I mentioned that the clearing was terrible for the rebels, no place to hide or fight back, well, now those disadvantages applied to the Imperials. Chaos reigned in front of the base and the casualties mounted. The Imperials had only 2 options, both bad. They stayed in the open field outside the generator, they'd be cut to pieces by poison-tipped arrows, suffocating as their lungs collapsed. But if they charged into the forest, they'd be on the Ewoks' home territory. This latter option is what tactic guides to this day recommend. In U.S. Army Ranger School, they call it react to ambush, and that's what the Imperials did, but it just meant they'd be slaughtered in the woods instead of the field in front of the base. So the Imperials took the least bad option and charged into the woods where death awaited them. From the history I quoted above, biker scouts raced over and around the scurrying droids, blasting away at the Ewoks who grew fiercer every time their fur was scorched. They were knocking scouts off speeder bikes by stringing vines between trees at throat level. They were throwing rocks, jumping out of trees, impaling with spears, entangling with nets. They were everywhere. Stormtroopers fired their laser pistols at furry creatures, killing or wounding many, only to be overrun by dozens or more in their place. Biker scouts chased squealing Ewoks in the woods and were knocked from their bikes by volleys of rocks launched from trees. End quote. When we think of Ewoks, we think of adorable animals. We don't think of stone hammers crushing the skulls of stormtroopers. When we think of Ewoks, we think of giant tree houses. We don't think of stormtroopers suffocating to death as their lungs collapsed. When we think of Ewoks, we think of Wicket smiling and waddling side to side. We don't think of the mobs of Ewoks with teeth bared spearing a fallen stormtrooper until he bleeds to death. From the stormtrooper account recorded by Voron Nall. I quote, "Some of our men chased the indigents into the woods and fell into hidden pits lined with stakes fixed in the ground. Scout troopers flew through tripwires that broke their necks. Elsewhere, the indigents overpowered troopers through sheer numbers, holding them down until they got their helmets off, and other abos could kill them with stone axes or knives made of volcanic glass. And every time one of our men fell, the indigents had another blaster. They knew every tree and rock, and they picked us off one by one." End quote. It seems as if the Ewoks had decided to use every weapon they had. This is a David and Goliath story replete with a slingshot wielded with deadly accuracy. Imagine a 5-pound rock crashing down on your head. Surprise attacks, jumping on troopers and beating them with small hammers or hatchets. And the Ewoks didn't just have one ambush set. The whole forest was filled with many ambushes to take down even more stormtroopers as they charged into the forest. They even attacked from the sky. I quote, "The next phase of the assault began. The Ewoks and kite-like animal-skin hang gliders started dropping rocks on the stormtroopers or dive-bombing with spears." End quote. But surely if the Imperials had an advantage, it would be in command and control. They had radios and computers in control rooms. But this advantage wouldn't materialize. As Lieutenant Voren Nall described, and I quote, "The Ewoks, with their combination of chants, screams, trumpets, and drum rhythms, and knowledge of how sound carries in the forest, can match the Imperials for communication and coordination. More importantly, by separating the Imperials, they would be more likely to become disoriented and confused." End quote. Communication is one of those neglected areas of the battlefield. When we think of great militaries, we think of weapons and fighters, not how they're talking to one another. The German Blitzkrieg wasn't just a triumph of mobility, it was a triumph of sophisticated communication networks that could cross hundreds of miles. The Japanese in World War II managed to coordinate an attack across an entire Pacific Ocean. Perhaps my favorite example is the Formix. They created an Ansible that could bypass the speed of light, communicate instantly across star systems, which the humans later copied, now giving them the edge in communication. The Ewoks didn't have electricity, but they had systems arguably just as sophisticated. They built their horns with such brilliant craftsmanship that by blowing on them, they lit up from the pressure. Just imagine how far that sound would travel. But what's the old phrase? Not going to go down without putting up a fight? And the Imperials weren't going to go down without putting up that fight. They had one key advantage: mobile armor, the ATSTs, or scout walkers. The philosophy of warfare, since horses were domesticated, had always been about forcing the infantry, the foot soldiers, to deal with mounted soldiers. First horses, then tanks, then bipedal armored walker, or four-legged armored walkers in this galaxy. And yes, this is a very Terran-focused narrative. ATSTs gave the Imperials the historic mounted cavalry advantage over the Ewoks. Ewoks couldn't hide from their advanced sensors. ATSTs' control cabins had a holographic 360-degree view of their surroundings. From this raised platform, their heavy blasters could rain hellfire down upon the Ewoks. And this is what killed Nanta in our opening. From the Rebel perspective, things weren't going much better either. The whole point of this ambush was to allow General Solo and the Pathfinders to break into the garrison, which they couldn't do. As the battle moved into the forest, Han Solo hunkered down in front of the base. He was secure in his position, but also stuck and also wide open. General Solo tried to hotwire the front door and failed. Then Princess Leia got shot. R2-D2, their astromech droid, tried to break open the door, but he was shot and malfunctioned. Up in space, things weren't going much better. Rebel ships were being blown out of the sky by the Death Star. The second Death Star had upgraded super lasers so that it could target capital-class starships. You can imagine the havoc that this wreaked on the Rebel fleet. The Ewoks and Rebels were at a key juncture. If the Ewoks couldn't stop the Empire's mobile armor, they were doomed, and their home village was probably doomed as well. If the rebels couldn't get inside the base, well then all was truly lost. But the Ewoks were prepared for this very moment. Remember, Wicket had seen the steel beast and his words die. That was back in episode 2, if you remember. And the Ewoks had likely started preparing traps soon after this. Some of their attempts failed spectacularly, trying and failing to use ropes to trip scout walkers. That just resulted in the Ewoks being dragged along the ground behind them. Catapults with stones failed too. Again, this is mobile armor. All the rocks did was alert the walkers to your location. Other Ewoks tried to jam pebbles and twigs into the joints of the ATSTs to stop their movement. That didn't work. It was better, but it wasn't foolproof. At times, they tried pouring burning lizard oil into the ATSTs. But what did work was using the forest against the walkers. In one case, the Ewoks used suspended logs to smash the head of an ATST as it walked into the trap. In another, they used a set of logs on top of a hill to trip an ATST. Walkers never worked well on uneven terrain, and this technique could quickly disable them. This is where the Ewoks and Chief Chirpa show their true tactical genius. Though they're clearly capable of hiding, the Ewoks ran along open paths, guiding the ATSTs right into their traps. They used their complex communications to alert each other as well of impending walker advances. Which begs another question. How did the Ewoks have time to prepare these giant traps? Most likely the Ewoks used log traps to defend against Gorax attacks. Gorax were the 30-meter tall predators that lived in the desert region of Endor, which I described in our first episode. If the Ewoks already had Gorax traps prepared, then it simply became a matter of guiding the ATSTs into their traps. Or, likely, the Ewoks had studied the limited paths the ATSTs could travel down going through the forest, and they planned to lure them into the traps that way. Or they made new traps in the weeks leading up to the battle. As I said above, the Ewoks had set up the gold standard of ambushes. Well, they'd also created a forest that was filled with ambushes for ATSTs and stormtroopers. From the history, and I quote, "They dug pits which they covered with branches, then lured the walkers to chase them until the clumsy armored vehicles toppled into the dugouts. They started rock slides. They dammed a small nearby stream and then opened the floodgates, deluging a host of troops and 2 more walkers. They ganged up and then ran away. They jumped on top of walkers with high branches and poured pouches of burning lizard oil into gun slits. They used knives and spears and slings and made scary war shrieks to confound and dismay the enemy." Of course, if you're already on top of the ATSTs to pour burning oil inside the gun slits, could you go a step further? Why not try to get inside, take control of one of these massive beasts? But the Ewoks couldn't pull this off alone. They'd studied Imperial tech like speeder bikes, but they'd never seen the inside of an ATST or its phenomenally complicated controls. They needed someone who knew how to work this machine. Someone who knew how human technology worked. They needed the help of a rebel, but not just any rebel, the biggest rebel, the fiercest rebel. Chewbacca. You see, Chewbacca didn't stay with General Solo at the start of the fighting. No, he plunged into the forest to kill stormtroopers. Chewbacca strikes me as the type of warrior who's not content to just sit back and let other people do the fighting. No, born and raised in the forest of Kashyyyk, he's going to get his paws dirty. Or bloody. It's also important that Chewbacca was from Kashyyyk, which was a forest planet, specifically a planet with some of the tallest trees in the galaxy. The trees were called Rorschire trees, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and they could live for 10,000 years and grow to 400 meters in height. Wookiees lived in the top of these trees, which meant they are some of the best climbers in the galaxy. Chewbacca was also perfect for this mission because he was the only rebel who could quickly scale the trees of Endor. The fearsomeness of Chewbacca, who the rebels disarmingly nicknamed Chewie, comes through in this quote from history. I quote, "Scores of them rallied behind Chewbacca, who had grown rather fond of them during the course of the previous night. He'd become their mascot, and they, his little country cousins. So it was with a special ferocity now that they had come to each other's aid. Chewbacca was flinging stormtroopers left and right in a selfless Wookiee frenzy, anytime he saw them harming his small friends. The Ewoks, for their part, formed equally self-sacrificing cadres to do nothing but follow Chewbacca and throw themselves upon any soldiers who started getting the upper hand with him." End quote. Chewbacca was a notoriously good fighter and shot. He went to battle with a bowcaster, a Wookiee weapon that fired explosive shells. Most humans weren't even strong enough to load one of these bowcasters, let alone fire it. 2 Ewoks, Wunka and Whittle, worked with Chewbacca, and they supplied the rope and knew which trees they could swing on to get on the roof of an oncoming ATST. Which they did, as Chewbacca gave a Tarzan-like roar. I mentioned last episode the Decisive Battle. In some ways, this was the decisive moment of the entire galactic civil war. Without a Wookiee and 2 Ewoks boarding the top of an AT-ST, the Empire survives. The entire Rebel fleet is torn to pieces by the new Death Star. Every leader is killed, and whatever is left is just fragments. As long as one AT-ST survived to fight the Ewoks, Imperials still had the edge, and Solo couldn't get into the bunker. In command of the AT-ST, Chewbacca, an excellent pilot, began gunning down unsuspecting AT-STs and killing countless stormtroopers who didn't realize that the AT-ST had switched sides. Imagine the terror when you think an AT-ST is here to rescue and then it starts annihilating you. The AT-STs were dangerous for Ewoks. The threat to stormtroopers clad in bright white armor running through the forest was even greater. At the front of the base, the rebels were out of options. They shot the last of the stormtroopers, but had no good way into the garrison. General Solo came up with one final trick. Turns out he knew exactly how to get into a place like this. One of his Pathfinders in a stolen Imperial uniform gave a radio call to the main base asking for reinforcements. When they came out, they found themselves surrounded by rebels and Ewoks, looking bloody and mean, as one history describes it. With this, Solo and the rebels can implant the thermal detonators and destroy the shield generator. Soon as the shield generator exploded, the rebel fleet finally flew into the second Death Star core, fired some well-placed shots, and blew up the whole thing. This ended up killing the Emperor and disabling most of the Imperial fleet. Darth Vader died in the battle as well. It's like the Hitler and Stalin of this time period were killed simultaneously. Or as if this galaxy's Saruman and Sauron had died in the same battle. After the battle, a lot of Imperials comforted themselves with the thought that following the destruction of the second Death Star, the debris fell onto the moon of Endor. As the theory goes, these pieces became asteroids that bombarded the surface of Endor. Some Imperial veterans who never gave up the cause believed the Ewoks were wiped out in this Holocaust. This was a trope commonly repeated in Imperial propaganda, and it's a clever theory, but is almost too clever by half. The rebels used their tractor beams to stop debris from falling into the moon, saving the Ewoks. Indeed, our surviving holovid accounts show the rebels partying on the moon with the Ewoks. Later histories revealed that the Death Star debris ended up falling on the ocean moon of Endor, a different moon entirely that's called Kef Bir. You want a final piece of evidence to debunk this theory? The travel company Star Tours still goes to Endor to this day. You couldn't go to a burned out moon, could you? I don't think I can understate how much this battle meant to the history of the galaxy. I opened last episode describing the Decisive Battle, and this truly was a decisive battle. As decisive as any other battle in history. Like Ender Wiggins destroying the home planet of the Formix, the Allies dropping the atom bomb, or the Avengers and their allies defeating Thanos in the Infinity War. Yes, battles were fought after this moment between the rebels and the remnants of the Empire, but this was the point where the war was all but over for the Empire. Without Palpatine, the center couldn't hold. The rebels had won the war. It would just take time to consolidate all their victories. I've said before I have trouble figuring out where to start these histories. I keep wanting to go back and back to fill in the context. Well, I could say the same thing about the ending of this battle. How do you talk about the end of the Empire when by some accounts the Emperor returned 6 years later in a cloned body? While we do have a lot of histories of the time after the Battle of Endor, there is some controversy about what happened next. To borrow a phrase from earlier, things seem to change every year or so, usually around December. This leaves us with essentially two histories, an older, more established account, and then an updated version. In earlier histories, the capital planet of this galaxy called Coruscant immediately flipped to rebel control. Quickly after that, many planets joined Coruscant, declaring support for the rebels. The rebels changed their name to the New Republic, reestablishing the old democratic government that existed before Emperor Palpatine took over. We've quoted Lieutenant Voren Nal extensively throughout this series, and it makes sense to do so again, and I quote, "With the death of Palpatine, the Empire began to unravel almost immediately. The chain of command disintegrated as commanders, generals, grand admirals, and advisors scrambled for power, and low-level officers had to choose which Imperial faction to support. Open warfare was an inevitability, and this continuing conflict allowed the undermanned and under-equipped Rebel Alliance, newly christened as the New Republic, to make impressive gains in a short time. End quote. Tempted to say this brought peace to the galaxy, but frankly, that wouldn't be true. The Galactic Civil War still raged across multiple sectors, with Imperial warlords grabbing whatever territories they could throughout the galaxy. The newer histories tell a similar story with some crucial differences. In this updated telling, the New Republic and the Empire were more evenly matched even after the Emperor died. They kept fighting until a decisive final battle was fought over Jakku that finally ended the Empire. The remaining Imperial elements then fled to the unknown regions outside of the galaxy to rebuild as a new military entity called the First Order. But that's a future story for a future podcast series. And even crazier non-political stories are out there. To give just one example, there's a story that aliens invaded an outer rim system called Bakura, and Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and General Solo had to intervene. But what happened to the Ewoks? Like most histories of this war, I've described the impact on the human side of the equation. But I've ignored what happened to the Ewoks, which most histories do as well. This usually means we've ignored the costs of the war for the Ewoks. None of the histories I've read even try to provide an account of the casualties taken on each side. Multiple accounts describe many dead on both sides, so we'll have to assume they were high. The Ewoks likely suffered severe casualties, but we'll never know for sure. So what did happen to the Ewoks after the battle? What do we actually know? Well, they faded back into history. Recorded history, that is. Some reports indicate that after the Battle of Endor, Shaman Logray was replaced by his apprentice Paplu, and then banished from the village because he advocated eating the rebels. His name was excised from the Song of Remembrance, erasing his memory from the village because he practiced the, and I quote, dark arts. Wicket was promoted to lead warrior of the village, and later became the chief of Bright Tree Village. Anything more than that, we just don't know. And with time, the Ewoks' role in the battle has been minimized or discounted entirely. But that would be a mistake. If you want to ask if I have an ulterior motive for this series, well, this is it. Remember, the Imperials on the ground felt like the Ewoks defeated them, not the rebels. Here's two final quotes that show just how those soldiers who fought on the Forest Moon felt about the Ewoks that defeated them. From Hume Tarl talking to Sindel Tawani, whose account we've used extensively this series, and I quote, "You look like you don't believe me, but I was there. I saw what those Ewoks did. The historians love to talk about alleged Imperial atrocities, but what about what I saw on the Forest Moon? They slaughtered us like animals, Miss Tawani. Shouldn't that count as an atrocity?" Or the account of another anonymous soldier, and I quote, "You know, by the end of the battle, I was glad to be taken prisoner by Solo and the others. At least a rebel would have shot you." End quote. The neglected point is that the Ewoks were underestimated by the Emperor, and he paid for that with his life. They were underestimated by the Imperial commanders on the ground, and they too paid for their lives, as did his men. But even now we underestimate them. The most common stories of the Ewoks have them as cute, harmless creatures tangential to the battle, when they were vital to the rebel victory, and we shouldn't forget that. After the battle was over, the Rebel Alliance convened on the Forest Moon to celebrate. And as we know, like the Ewoks like to do, a huge party broke out. There was dancing and drinking, and a feast. Which brings us to our darkest moment yet, something we've mentioned in each episode of this series. The Ewoks consumed the flesh of their enemies. Again, how do we open up this episode? The Ewoks literally were trying to cook the humans. The battlefield filled with dead Imperials, with the Ewoks playing their helmets for drums, we're left with only one conclusion. We can assume that the Ewoks and their Rebel Alliance guests celebrated the best way they knew how, by eating dead stormtroopers. We've been telling you about Audible on this program for a long time, and there's a reason that you hear us discuss them as often as we do. It's because this is not a program that relies on advertising. We're listener supported, so we can afford to do advertising that conforms to the host's radical beliefs on certain things. For example, reading. I'm a voracious reader, and I'm one of those weird guys that believes we all benefit from reading. Just why we've long been champions of Audible. Allows reading to be brought into the modern world for your hectic 21st century life. But Audible is always expanding their features for listeners in every timeline and dimension. Like, say, what if you survived a nuclear apocalypse and you just love reading? Well, Audible's got you covered too. Audible has a new program specifically designed for survivors of societal collapse and apocalypse. That's right, if you're the type of bookworm who just adores delving into the fantastic worlds of Dickens and Shaw or the poetry of Shelley and Frost, but one day you're reading in a bank vault during your lunch break and you survived a nuclear war. You're the only living soul in a vast, desolate wasteland. Audible can help. After all, you've got food enough to last for years and the local library survived. You have all the time in the world now. Unless you step on your glasses. With Audible, you can now listen to those same books provided you find a hand-cranked battery to operate whatever smart device you have. You can share excerpts and clips if you discover any other survivors, provided they aren't cannibalistic gangs roving the wasteland for nebbish bank tellers to eat. You can also listen at different speeds, which will help you get through more books while the battery on your phone drains. You can get a free audiobook with a 30-day trial. Go to audible.com/fakead and listen for a change.
Michael, one half of the Spec Media production team here with some brief podcast housekeeping notes. We've got 1, maybe 2 episodes left this season. Then we're planning a question and answer episode to finish off the season. Send your questions to info@specmediapodcast.com or tweet at us @specmediapod. Next, we've appreciated the love and praise in iTunes, but we need to keep it going. Please rate and review the podcast if you haven't. Not just iTunes, any podcast service, however you listen. Yes, every podcast in existence across every dimension throughout the multiverse asks for this. You know why? Because it really does help. So let's thank the latest reviewers on iTunes. Thanks go out to Sonner Rose, WBM Jr. 81, and J.I. Copey, or Jacopi, or Jick Oppie. You know who you are. Leave a review and we'll read it in future episodes. Finally, follow us on social media to stay up to date. We're on Twitter and Facebook, and while you're there, share the podcast on whatever social platform exists in your reality. Thank you in advance. See you next time.